Okay, kiddos, welcome back. We are going to be talking about the beginnings of the post-World War I period today, starting with the infamous Treaty of Versailles. If you have not finished the World War I Parts 1 and 2 lectures yet, you're going to want to go through those and take the notes, do the quick writes. If you haven't finished your Influenza of 1918 project yet, that's okay. You have a whole week to do that from when it was assigned. So you can continue to work on that, but just watch this and do a quick review at the end of it. It's not going to take too much out of you. But it's really important to cover what was going on in Europe following the war because, of course, the whole world fought, but it was, again, centered in Europe. That's where most of the fighting was going on, plus some on the seas. So we're going to talk about what was happening in this period in Central Europe. So meanwhile, in this time, the war has ended. It's 1919. Things are done. And the armistice has been called, and it was the end of the war, right? So now they have to figure out what kind of terms by which this war is going to end, and that is a major thing. That is going to result in a very consequential and infamous document known as the Treaty of Versailles. Yes, indeed. The Treaty of Versailles is something that you will hear referred to over and over again. It's practically a metaphor these days for a failed attempt to create an agreement following a conflict. So the Treaty of Versailles, very important. Where does the word Versailles come from? Speaking of conflicts that we've learned about, maybe you remember it came from the French royal estate that the king and queen lived at during the French Revolution until they were yanked from there and brought to Paris and put in prison. Um, so this is a very symbolically important place for Europe in general, and it is where they decided to create the treaty that they wrote between the Central Powers, which was basically at this point Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, and the Allied Powers, what had become to be called the Allied Powers, which was mainly the U.S., UK, France, and Italy had joined. So that's within Europe. Those are the main powers within that. There are also, of course, lots of other countries internationally, like Japan, Brazil, and also Portugal and the southern periphery of Europe as well. But they were not as big of players in this as these countries in Central Europe and the United States that had put in so much into this war. So we're going to learn about who's and what's of this situation and how it ended up happening. First off, the Big Four met at the Paris peace talks right after the armistice, after the peace was declared in 1919. Who are the Big Four, you might ask? Well, here they are. They are the leaders of the four primary allied nations. There's Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. So you got Wilson over here. You've got George Clemenceau, the Premier of France, who you got over here. You've got David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain. And you've got Vittorio Orlando, the Foreign Minister of Italy. So four guys, a lot of white hair, a lot of conversations about exactly how they're going to be making Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire pay up for what they saw as a disastrous and costly war that those countries kind of tended on to be in the losing end of. So let's talk about who these guys are and what's going on with them. First off, Woodrow Wilson. Here he is, President of the United States. Kind of a progressive and idealist guy. In reality, in the United States, domestically, he wasn't all that much of a progressive or idealist in some ways, particularly about race. He had the KKK screen a movie about their creation called Birth of a Nation at the White House. Some other stuff that was kind of dark about him, but he was also a product of his time, and that was very common at the time. Still, some stuff to think about. That said, you'll learn more about that when you get into U.S. history. But in terms of internationally, he was what you would call an idealist. He thought World War I was so awful that there's no way we could have it be anything other than the war to end all wars. And the only way to accomplish that is by doing some very specific stuff that would try to guarantee that future of lasting peace, which, as we might all understand from knowing that there was, in fact, a World War II, didn't work out so good. But he was certainly idealistic about it and had some ideas to approach that end. He had a 14-point plan for lasting peace. And it's a very important document that, again, you'll learn more about in U.S. history, but contained a lot of the foundations for what we think of as international politics and international rights these days about the sovereignty of nations and other ideas that are these modern concepts of basically international diplomacy and rights. And among them were self-determination, so the idea of nations to be able to determine their own fates in the world and what that would look like without necessarily being bullied around by larger powers. The idea of peace without victory. So the idea that in this case, for instance, with World War One, it didn't necessarily end in a resounding occupation of Germany and Austria-Hungary and all that. It kind of ended with a whimper after a really long stalemate, and just everybody got too tired to fight anymore. But Germany was more on the losing end of it. Um, Also, Russia lost a lot, you'll remember, and also note they were not actually invited to those peace talks because they had actually bowed out of the war a few months before, following the Russian Revolution, and lost a lot of Russian territory in the process. But this is a messy and very expensive war, and Woodrow Wilson saw the idea, well, let's try to establish some kind of a peace that everybody can agree on without having to have this victory that's total victory and total control over the other side. How can we get a lasting peace that everybody can basically come to terms with each other? Well, we'll see how that went. Part of this is also the idea of disarmament. So this militarism that had been building up with this arms race between these countries trying to get bigger, meaner, faster, harder weapons, spending more on it. Again, a little bit outside both sides of the mouth here, right? The United States had been building their own military under Wilson, and they had also been selling weapons to the nations of Europe. But, now he was asking for disarmament. He was thinking that's the only way to a lasting peace. And again, remember the U.S. didn't get involved into the war for quite a while, so the U.S. was pushing a different kind of agenda here. He also was talking about fair treatment of colonial peoples. Again, there's all kinds of nuance to this. I mean, the United States had our own colonies in the Philippines, for instance, and in Puerto Rico and Hawaii, these different countries that were basically colonies, which had mixed bag of efforts in terms of how well we treated our own colonial peoples. Although by most accounts, not nearly as badly as say Belgium did, or how people were being treated in South Africa. But we were treating our own African Americans in the South pretty badly at the same time. So you also note that this fair treatment of colonial peoples didn't include the abolishment of colonies. Colonies were certainly not abolished in this period, and continued to be a sticking point throughout the time period, and probably continued the tensions. He also wanted to establish the League of Nations, a very ambitious idea. In fact, one of his best. And this is kind of a precursor to the United Nations. So that was kind of a really, really big idea. And a lot of countries signed up for it. Notably, the United States did not end up being one of them, but we will talk more about that coming up. Who else we got here? Next in the line, George Clemenceau. Here he is. France had been utterly destroyed in World War One. You probably remember from the Schlieffen Plan and other things that we looked at. Most of the fighting had taken place on French soil, France and Belgium in particular, some of the Netherlands. So France was just ravaged and smashed by World War One. Cities were in ruins. Lots and lots of civilians had been killed. Lots of soldiers had been killed. Really nasty stuff. Others had been hurt. Clemenceau really wanted protection from further German attacks. So this whole disputed area along the French and German border was still going to be an issue, and he wanted to try to figure out how to make that less of an issue. He also wanted to get rid of the German military. George Clemenceau was very interested in not just disarmament to cutting down their military, but entirely removing this military or making it just a peacekeeping force within the country. He wanted to make Germany pay for the war because France felt that they had gotten a raw deal and got invaded, and they felt that Germany should in fact pay. So that was a big deal for France. David Lloyd George of the UK, Britain. Here he is. He was the most afraid of the German U-boats. So again, what did Britain have that was so powerful? It had its navy, and it had the two-power rule, remember? that its navy should be more powerful than the second two biggest navies combined. So yeah, those persnickety submarines were sure getting in the way of keeping Britain's navy as the most powerful and dominant in the world, because one thing Britain definitely did not give up at this point was its colonies, although some became independent countries like South Africa, but ones that were still very closely aligned with Britain and were part of the greater British Empire still have the Queen on the money and all that, right? So yeah, he really wanted to get rid of the German Navy. He wanted to have unimpeded British access to its colonies around the world, again, especially India. He wanted those German colonies. So those three colonies in Africa, he wanted those. He wanted like the different islands that they had. Wanted those German colonies, and he wanted England to get paid for the losses, especially losses of soldiers and weaponry and their dreadnought boats that had been taken out, and again lots of losses from shipping and merchant ships that had been sunk. Not as much damage on England's land. There had been some artillery shot under the land, destroying some a few seaside villages a little bit, but it was more symbolic than it was economically important. So Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Remember, Italy was part of the Central Powers for a while, but had switched sides mid-war, and they broke their treaty and switched sides to join the Allied powers. They entered the war because Britain promised to give them cities in Austria. So they switched sides, avoided fighting on the alliances that they had been attached to. So they were going to get chunks of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which also happened to be pieces of the Balkans, which of course, as we well know, are complicated. In particular, these cities were Tyrol and Trieste, and even today, Trieste is actually right on the border of Slovenia, which is part of the Balkans, and many people there actually speak. They actually speak Slovenian. Some speak Croatian, so it's kind of as much a Baltic city, a Slavic city, as it is an Italian city. Um, he also demanded more, but when the others refused to give him more of Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Orlando just walked out. He was done with this, and this set the stage for Italy forging its own path in the couple decades coming up, which eventually led to the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini in Italy, and we'll talk about that. So at this point, the Big Four became the Big Three. So Germany, what's going to happen with Germany? That's a big question, right? The Treaty of Versailles. This is at Versailles in the big hall, and this is the meeting of all these diplomats getting together to write up a plan for what's going to happen to Germany. And in fact, they did do some strong, in terms of what they were doing to governments, they did some strong imposition on what was going to happen to Germany's government to avoid continuing the war. They had said they had to change their government. So they made Germany establish the Weimar Republic in 1919. It was a new democratic German government. It kept those same institutions that Bismarck had set up, the Bundesrat and the Reichstag, but now they actually were democratic institutions. They actually had duly elected bodies that people elected within the country and were representative of people. Germany wasn't actually particularly into this. They preferred to be under the Kaiser. They preferred to have this strong rule, but the Kaiser was forced into irrelevance and into a symbolic role, and the Weimar Republic became the new rule. So Bismarck was long gone at this point. So they also insisted on war reparations. So this was a really big deal. The bulk of the money was going to go to France and Belgium, right? So bulk of the money is going to go to France and Belgium because that's where all this fighting took place, or the vast majority of it took place. Then the UK following that. 226 billion German marks in 1918 dollars. So that's 226 billion in the current currency. It's a really incredible amount of money today. It would be the equivalent to a couple of $1 trillion in modern U.S. currency. So a lot of money. The U.S. didn't get really that much. It only got like 100 million marks out of this. So in 1921, within a couple of years, it was reduced to 132 billion marks. So about a little less than half. So that's equal to 31.4 billion U.S. today. Sorry, I didn't say trillion. I said trillion earlier, but it was more like 34.1.4 billion US. In 2014, it would have been 445 billion. So it was around a trillion. It would have been around a trillion before that, like close to a trillion in today's money, and about almost 500 billion in 2014 cash. I should update it to now. Probably close to 1 trillion, a little more. So lots and lots and lots of money still. They reduced it because like, okay, that's a lot of money. Maybe we'll give you a break, but still, that's a lot of money for a country that's just failed in a war and is being pushed into a new form of government and is in an awkward position. So Germany was also disarmed. It was demilitarized. The new German army was restricted to 100,000 all volunteer force with its men serving 12-year enlistments. Germany was denied any military aircraft, tanks, or heavy artillery. They had 6 warships they were restricted to. The German Navy was restricted to 6 warships. They were pre-dreadnought battleships, so earlier versions of battleships. They were told they could not have any planes, uh, no submarines. Oh, sick burn. Sorry, Germany, no U-boats. Bummer. So tied into this also was that the Allies occupied the Rhineland here. That is this area between France and Germany. A very key region. It's a key industrial and coal mining region. It's been an important part of Germany. And so the occupation of the Rhineland took place following the armistice with Germany on 11th of November 1918, which is again near the end of 1918, thing that ended World War One. The occupying armies consisted of American, Belgian, British, and French forces. And then under the Treaty of Versailles, German troops were banned from all territory west of the Rhine River. So this is the Rhine, this big black line here, right? This black line here, that's the border between France and Germany. This black line here is the Rhine River, and Germans were banned from all territory here west of the Rhine, as you can see, and within 50 kilometers east. So even 50 kilometers east, they really did not have access to this very important river that went to the sea for trade from industrial and coal products from this region. Pretty big deal. A lot of money, a lot of potential for rebuilding the economy there. The League of Nations declared it neutral, demilitarized, but with Allied troops in place as peacekeepers to assure that Germany complied. Can you think of any areas like that today? Peacekeeping troops, parts of Africa, maybe, definitely Iraq, things like that. In the years following, if Afghanistan, although we still end up fighting there a lot, in the years following the Treaty of Versailles, these troops actually ended up being almost all French, and they fully occupied the Rhineland. So this area became French in the years following it, strictly controlling all important industrial areas. They didn't leave the Rhineland until 1925. One side effect of this was that French soldiers and German women had a lot of children together. They were seen by Germans as a continuing French pollution of German culture, shunned by broader German society and called Rhineland bastards. Children fathered by French colonial troops of African ancestry, who were mostly French, were especially despised. They were partially black, and they became targets of the Nazi sterilization programs in the 1930s that we'll hear about. Charles Bukowski, the American poet, was actually born in 1920 in Andernach in this region as the son of a German mother and a Polish-American U.S. soldier serving among the occupation troops and soldiers. So the mandate system, this was very important, tied into it. The mandate system had to do with the Middle East. So the colonies of the former Central Powers were to be given to allied nations. This is really, really important here. So this is the Middle East here, what they were calling Arabia at the time. So the colonies of the former Central Powers were given to the allied nations. Turkey, which was formerly the Ottoman Empire, had most of this land. They lost most of the land in Europe and the Middle East. Turkey is left in a toehold in what was considered Europe, which is here. The Turkish Straits, which was the area that was between Turkey and the Balkans, were put under the control of the League of Nations at a time when it was dominated by Britain and France. The land that was held by Turkey and Arabia was made into a mandate. The land was ruled by the British and French until the peoples of the areas were ready, quote unquote, to govern themselves. Oh, that's complicated. Syria and Lebanon ended up, they're supposedly given their independence sometime in the future. Yeah, well, that's a complicated thing because a lot of these mandates were carved up in such a way and these borders were delineated by the British and the French in such a way that they were all but guaranteed to fail as states because they had all of these different people within them who had different interests. So in Syria, you had all the Sunnis and Shiites who were being pushed together who would prefer to have not been. Up here in this area, which is between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, you had the Kurds who were split up and left without a state. In Iraq, you had different groups, again, Sunnis and Shiites in particular, who were being pushed into situations they did not like being in. And so these areas were set up for the most part to have a very difficult time as states. Saudi Arabia down here actually did better than some because they had a fairly unified kingdom, but difficult. And also, of course, Palestine here, British Palestine, which would eventually become Israel. So from the Ottoman Empire, again, Syria and Lebanon here, and then Egypt over here, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine down here. So these were supposedly to be given their independence, but difficult situations when you actually have things all split up, when you have these countries split up by, and constant conflict with each other because their borders make no sense, sort of like the scramble for Africa. Meanwhile, Persia over here was its own state and was under some colonial influence. But um, the armies from Britain, France, Greece, and Italy occupied what was left of Turkey, the area known as Asia Minor. It only served to anger nationalist Turks who sought to overthrow it. The Turks, the Ottomans, were treated particularly harshly due to several factors. One of these was the fact that they had defeated the British at the Battle of Gallipoli, which is a really major defeat. And an element of revenge was seen as driving this. The British did not like being beaten. And of course, there was also the Armenian genocide and other war atrocities that the Ottoman Muslims had committed against ethnic Christians in the empire that were closest to Turkey up to the north. So those were cited as justification for occupation of Turkey, essentially. There was also a very big element of racism, Islamophobia, and othering of the Turks as different from Europe, as being different from the mostly Christian states of Europe, even though Turkey had been considered part of Europe for a very long time. Most importantly, however, of course, was that there was a new resource in this oil, or in this region, that was becoming more and more vital. Yes, that was oil. And this is a vital resource to the increasingly oil-driven industrial economies of Europe and the United States. This continues to the present. So getting back to what was happening with Germany, uh, the war guilt clause. Big thing going on here. The war guilt clause. Germany must accept full blame for starting the war and for all damage. Article 231 in the treaty opened up the whole section they had to do on reparations for the war, things they had to pay back. Many Germans were under the impression that Wilson's 14 Points Treaty from a year earlier was going to remain the primary framework for the peace treaty, that it was this kind of like peace without victory thing, right? That we'll come to terms, we'll figure it out, it'll be okay, we'll be on an even keel with each other. But at the conference, Wilson actually got very ill early in the process and had to sit the negotiations out, leaving representatives to work on the treaty instead. These were not as powerful individuals as the leaders of France and Britain, these US envoys. So they were also less idealistic. They were more prone to compromise and more easily pushed around by France and Britain. So how would this be taken in contrast with Wilson's 14 points? So here's some of the things that are involved in it. As you think about this question, you don't have to write this down. There's no prompt for it, but just think about this. How would this be taken by the Germans in contrast to this 14 points? So Germany accepts responsibility for Germany and all of her allies in causing all the loss and damage during the war. It was hated. It was a hated part of the treaty. The idea that they were considered to be at fault for everything. Initially mistranslated uh, as this because Similar clauses appeared in all of the separate treaties signed by the different Central Powers individually, including the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. But it said that Germany accepts responsibility for Germany and her allies causing all the loss and damage during the war. It was all putting it onto Germany. So this is humiliating. It led to outcries from their people. It was very hated and their elected officials. Allies were surprised at this because they thought it was just a legal clause indicating that Germany must compensate the Allies. They're just like, no, it's just your fault legally. It's like a lawsuit. So you got to compensate people. It was partially worded by an American diplomat named John Foster Dulles, who is notorious for kind of screwing it up rhetorically. Um, Wilson's opinions underwent a change since the speech. He ended up being convinced by the other allies to seek stronger punishment for and reparations for Germany, and he made public statements to this effect, and it created a lot of problems. This started a system and a situation that would end up really backfiring on Europe and the world. So German colonies ended up being transferred. Asia Pacific was split between Japan. So Japan ended up taking much of this region. So north of the equator, which is right around, which is middle of the planet here, right around here. So north of the equator here, uh, Japan got everything, up in especially China and areas like that, and Australia. But this is the only German colony in this region. Actually, Japan had been doing their own actions in China, but this is the only area in Tsingtao in China, which was part of Germany. But then Africa was split between France, Britain, and Belgium. Um, so these different areas were split up by the different European powers. And then these islands were also split up between European powers. Japan didn't really like this too much. They figured this is kind of bunk. I mean, they got some of these islands, but then they also lost some of the other stuff. Italy got 0 new colonies. Oof. Again, leading to some major issues that are going to be arising. The European borders changed, right? So we had a lot of issues. Um, let's see, lots and lots and lots of issues. So there were new countries. The following land was taken away from Germany. So let's get into all this stuff here. Alsace-Lorraine was given to France. Eupen and Malmedy were given to Belgium. Northern Schleswig was given to Denmark. Holstein was given to Czechoslovakia. These are parts of Germany, or what were, had been parts of Germany. And West Prussia, Posen, and Upper Silesia were given to Poland. So all these the Polish corridor here ended up splitting Germany in two. Lots of these countries got different chunks. The Saar, Danzig, and Memel were put under the control of the League of Nations, and the people of these regions would be allowed to vote to stay in Germany or not in a future referendum. So there was a kind of big mix-up in Germany, and European borders changed as a result of this. And Austria and Hungary were split into the two different countries that they became. Also, interestingly, Germany had to return the Russian land taken in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Some of this land was made into new states. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, which are called the Baltics. And this enlarged Poland here also received some of the land. So what would have been part of Russia was made into these different parts, these different small countries, and given partially to Poland. In all, Germany lost about 27,000 square miles of territory and about 6.5 million inhabitants, further increasing resentment. Um, so, yeah, Austria and Hungary were treated as two completely different countries. So you can see that here on this map after this was signed. Both lost land to neighboring countries. This whole new state of Czechoslovakia here, right? This is effectively created out of this carve up of land from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and part of Germany here. Large blocks of land went to Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia too. Yugoslavia? Wait a minute. What's Yugoslavia? Well, that was the southern Serbic state dreamed about by the Serbians in the Black Hand. It was unified. They unified it, centralized in Belgrade in what was Serbia here. And it was based in Serbia. So Yugoslavia was this new, large, southern Slavic state. became very important. Bulgaria over here had to try and sign the Treaty of Neuilly. It lost land to the new state of Yugoslavia here, had to reduce military capacity, and had to pay reparations. Also, part of Austria, again, as we talked about in the beginning, ended up going to Italy down here. This whole region, little carve out, was for Italy, but Italy didn't get that much, and they were pretty mad about it. This area was still under dispute. So lots and changes, right? Here's those Baltics, by the way: Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and then this whole area, East Prussia, which was still considered to be part of Germany, but under this occupation. Wow. USSR, right? Well, that's not called Russia anymore. That's because it was now the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was a Soviet state. The Bolsheviks had won. So lots and lots and lots of change. Lots of change. The international reaction to the treaty. It was signed and it went into effect. Wilson was satisfied with it because he had changed his opinions, but Congress actually refused to ratify it, which was interesting because he had gotten sick and couldn't push for his idealistic ideas. He had been convinced that Germany should be punished later, but he didn't have much support in Congress or with the isolationist public at home because he ended up getting a little too gung ho on the punishment stuff. Republicans in Congress, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, didn't want to ratify the treaty because they felt that it enriched Britain and France too much at Germany's expense, and because the Irish were now fighting for independence from the United Kingdom, and the German populations in the United States were angry with it. So there was opposition in the U.S. Wilson was a Democrat, and the Congress was controlled by Republicans, and they also did not want to join the League of Nations. They objected to Article 10 in the League of Nations, which was a mutual defense pact where any member attacked by another nation must be aided by the rest of the League of Nations. Sound familiar? That would be an alliance. So they were a little leery about that as being a treaty, essentially an alliance. And so the U.S. Congress refused to join the League of Nations, even though it existed. Um, Russian communism, of course, at this point became what we would call the elephant in the room. And that was a really important thing. Everybody was scared of communism. The British public wanted Germany to pay, but they still felt some kinship with the German people. There was a lot of connections between the German royal family and the English royal family, genetically and otherwise. And the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, wanted Germany to remain something of a power because he wanted them to provide protection against Bolshevik Russia. They were afraid of the Russian communists. So that was a big deal, and that was also tied into what was happening in the United States. The Allies and slowly, quietly let Germany ignore the terms of the agreements. Starting with when they reduced the amount of payment. They really didn't want the Weimar Republic to go communist and ally with the Russians, and that was a threat of what would end up happening if Germany was kept under the very extreme terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So a real big thing going on here. However, it just left this mood in Germany of anger as it was felt that as a nation, Germany had been unfairly treated. They hated the clause blaming Germany for the cause of the war and the resultant financial penalties the treaty was bound to impose on Germany. Those who signed it, though they effectively had no choice, were known as the November criminals. Um, and many German citizens felt they were being punished for the mistakes of the German government in 1914, as it was felt that the government had declared war, not the people. So there were protests in the Reichstag and out in the streets. It's not hard to see why Germans were mad. Germany lost 10% of its land, all of its overseas colonies, 12.5% of its population, 16% of its coal, 48% of its iron industry. These were humiliating terms that they were dealing with too on the Treaty of Versailles, which made Germany accept blame for the war, total blame, limit their armed forces, and pay reparations. Although you will note too, looking back at this map, I mean, Austria-Hungary no longer existed as an empire. There was no empire here. That was the end of one of Europe's major empires. The Ottoman Empire had ended. They were carved right up. So there was a lot of changes going on. But still, this was a really big deal to Germany. And even though they are governed by the Weimar Republic, they remained very nationalistic. Um, it's important to remember, this is the important thing to remember about the Versailles Treaty, is that it was never enforced. So it matters very little whether it was too harsh or too lenient. The U.S. Senate never actually approved it, and ultimately the Germans only paid $9 billion in reparations. But the thing is, it was embarrassing because it pointed out how badly they lost the war, which was super, super embarrassing and led to some bad issues, including the rise of Adolf Hitler, which we will learn about coming up. French Marshal, many people in the Germany and France recognize this too. French military officials in particular, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch recognized this is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years, ominously. So today you're just going to do a quick assignment, which is going to talk about which countries you think did what, would have done what, and supported what aspects of the treaty. And that's going to be it for you for the day. Finish up your other assignment, and I'll see you next week.